She pressed the berry against her tongue and told herself it tasted like something. It didn't. It tasted like the end of every choice she had left. Her hands were trembling not from cold because the summer air sat thick and hot across the ridge, but from 3 days of nothing solid in her stomach, and a grief she hadn't named out loud yet, because naming it would make it permanent. She was 31 years old, kneeling in the dirt, and this was what surviving looked like. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this ride reaches. Nora Calloway had learned 2 things in the 8 months since her husband died. The first was that grief doesn't announce itself with weeping. It arrives quietly in practical disguises the moment you realize you've been standing in front of a cold stove for 20 minutes without remembering why you walked into the kitchen the moment you reach for a coffee cup on his side of the shelf. Before you remember, there is no his side anymore because the shelf, the cabin, the land, and every stick of furniture on it now belonged to a man in Cheyenne who held a note Gerald had signed without telling her. The second thing she learned was that shame travels faster on an empty stomach. She had been moving west for 6 weeks. Not toward anything specific. Moving west because east held the ruins of everything she'd built with Gerald Calloway, and north and south were directions without purpose when you had no map and no money and no name anyone recognized. West at least felt like the direction people went when they had nothing left to protect. She had 17 cents when she left the county line. She had spent 11 of those cents on a half loaf of bread outside a dry goods store in a town she couldn't remember the name of, and the woman behind the counter had looked at her the way people look at a stray dog, with that particular mixture of pity and inconvenience that makes the recipient wish they'd kept walking. By the time she reached the eastern edge of Grangerland, she had 6 cents a carpet bag with 2 dresses, her husband's pocket knife, and a tin cup that had survived every hardship, mostly because it was too dented to be worth stealing. The berries at the edge of the dry bush weren't ripe. She knew that. She'd grown up in Missouri farm country, and she knew the difference between something the earth was offering and something the earth was still withholding. But knowledge and hunger don't negotiate with each other. And so she picked them anyway, one at a time, pressing each one to her tongue and willing her body to accept whatever small mercy the bitterness contained. She didn't hear the horse until it stopped. She didn't look up immediately. Looking up meant acknowledging someone had seen her. And being seen right now in this particular posture, kneeling in the summer dust at the edge of a dying thorn bush, picking berries like a starving woman, because she was a starving woman, felt like something she wasn't ready to survive on top of everything else. So she kept her eyes down. She picked another berry. She pressed it to her tongue. "Ma'am." The voice was low and unhurried, not the voice of a man who was startled, the voice of a man who had decided in the moment before he spoke exactly how much he intended to say. She looked up. He was sitting his horse on the ridge above her, and the summer sun came over his shoulder, in a way that made him difficult to read at first, just a broad-shouldered silhouette in a worn canvas trail coat. Hat brim pulled low, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn. The horse was a big roan, dusty from whatever trail they'd come down from, and it stood still with the particular patience of an animal that trusted its rider completely. She said nothing. He didn't push. He sat there for a moment looking at her, the way a man looks at something that doesn't fit the landscape he expected, not unkind, not intrusive. Just reading the situation with the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of solving problems before they become emergencies. Then he stepped down from the horse in one smooth motion, and she noticed he moved like the mountain itself had taught him, deliberate, unhurried, like a man who'd spent so much time on difficult terrain that flat ground felt almost too easy. He didn't approach her. He stopped about 10 yards back, took off his hat, and held it at his side. "Reed Granger," he said. "This is my land you're on. I'm not saying that to make trouble. I'm saying it so you know who you're talking to." Nora set down the branch she was holding. She got to her feet without hurrying because hurrying would have implied either fear or embarrassment, and she had decided somewhere around the 4th week of walking that she was done performing either one for strangers. "Nora Calloway," she said. "I wasn't aware of the property line. I'll move on." He didn't say anything right away. He was watching her face, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was reading things she hadn't intended to show: the pallor under her sun-weathered skin, the way she'd set down the branch too carefully, like her hands weren't entirely steady, the way she'd stood up just a half-second slower than a well-fed woman would have. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "West." "West covers a lot of ground." "I'm aware." He put his hat back on, tilted the brim against the sun. "When did you last eat a real meal, Mrs. Calloway?" The question was direct without being cruel, and somehow that made it harder to answer than if he'd said it meanly. Meanness she could deflect. Straightforward concern from a stranger had no clean angle to push away from. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him steadily. "3 days," she said, because lying about it felt worse than admitting it, and she was so tired of expending energy on things that cost her without paying her back. He didn't react with pity. She noticed that. He nodded once, like she'd answered a practical question, and looked out across the ridge for a moment, the way men look when they're thinking through something they've already half decided. "I've got a ranch about 2 miles that direction," he said, tipping his hat toward the north without pointing dramatically, just a small natural gesture. 12 men working cattle through the summer. My cook quit 3 weeks ago, and I haven't replaced him. We're eating whatever the men throw together, which is bad enough that 2 of them asked me this week if they could take shifts over the fire." A pause. "They can't." Nora watched him. "Can you cook?" he asked. 3 words, no performance in them, no charity wrapped in a question. Just a direct inquiry about a skill, the way you'd ask a carpenter if he could work with oak or a blacksmith if he'd shod a mule before. She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not exactly, because relief implied the danger was already past, and she was wise enough to know it wasn't. But something. The sensation of a door appearing in a wall she'd been pressing against for 6 weeks. "Yes," she said, "I can cook." He nodded again. $1.50 a week. Meals included. You'd have your own room in the ranch house. It's small, but it's private. Work starts at 4 in the morning. Breakfast for 12 men, midday meal left out before we ride supper when we come back in. He met her eyes. "That's the offer. It's a fair one." "It is," she said. "You want to think on it?" "No," she said. "I'll take it." He looked at her for a moment longer, not searching for doubt, she thought, but something else. Maybe confirming what he already suspected, which was that she wasn't the kind of woman who made decisions she hadn't already thought through. "All right," he said. He turned back to the roan and gathered the reins. "You can ride behind or walk. 2 miles won't take long either way." "I'll walk," she said. He accepted that without comment. He swung back up into the saddle with that same unhurried economy of motion, and they set off across the summer grass. Him on horseback, her on foot, 2 miles apart from each other in the ways that mattered, and yet moving in the same direction, which was, Nora thought, as accurate a description of most human partnerships as any she'd ever encountered. The Granger Ranch sat in a wide mountain valley that the summer had treated unevenly. The grass on the lower slopes was still green enough, fed by snowmelt running down from the peaks that stood blue-gray in the distance, but the flat ground near the outbuildings was worn to packed dirt, and the kitchen garden beside the main house had gone half wild with things that had been planted in spring sprawling in unpruned tangles, and things that should have been watered, leaning sideways like they'd given up asking. 12 men working the land meant 12 men's worth of evidence. A bunkhouse with saddles hung over the fence rail, a smithing shed with the door propped open, a cattle barn, large enough that she could smell it before she could see it clearly. The main house was 2 stories built solid, not beautiful, but the kind of building that made no apologies for what it was. Functional, durable, a structure that had been designed to outlast the man who built it. Reed Granger stepped down from the horse at the hitching post and handed the reins to a young hand who appeared from the barn with the automatic efficiency of someone trained to anticipate. "Jesse," Reed said, "tell the men there'll be a proper supper tonight." The young hand, Jesse, barely 18 by the look of him, with a sunburned nose and curious eyes, glanced at Nora with the undisguised interest of someone who had seen very few women on this property. "Yes, sir," Jesse said. Then to Nora, with a hat tip that was more instinct than calculation. "Ma'am?" "Jessie," she said. Reed gestured toward the house. "Kitchen's through the back. I'll show you the stores." The kitchen was large by frontier standards and catastrophically disorganized by any standard. 3 weeks of men improvising meals had left it in the particular chaos that results from people who are competent at other things trying to do something they fundamentally don't understand. The flour bin was open. There was dried meat hanging in the wrong place too close to the window where the summer heat would work on it. A pot with something hardened to its bottom sat on the cold stove with the cheerful indifference of an object no one had wanted to be responsible for. She stood in the doorway and took it in. Reed watched her face. "It's not what it was," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite apology, more like the measured acknowledgement of a man who knows a problem is his, even if it isn't his fault. "How long ago did your cook leave?" she asked. 22 days. "What happened to him?" "His mother took sick down in Colorado. He went to see to her." Reed paused. "He was a good man. I'm not holding it against him." Nora walked into the kitchen. She set her carpetbag on the floor beside the door because there was nowhere clean to put it, and she began moving through the space the way she moved through any unfamiliar kitchen, methodically touching nothing, yet just reading the room. Where the heat from the stove would travel. Where the light came in strongest. Which shelves were within reach and which required effort. Where the previous cook had kept things which she could tell from the ghost marks on shelves where containers had sat long enough to leave impressions in the dust. "What stores do you have?" she asked. "Come see." The pantry was better than she expected. Not generous, but sufficient sacks of dried beans cornmeal flour in reasonable quantity. Salt pork, dried peppers, some tinned goods that had come up from the last supply run. Root vegetables in a bin, some of them soft, but most of them usable. She saw eggs, not many, and a crock of lard. She saw a jar of molasses that had never been opened. She also saw shoved to the back of the bottom shelf a rusted tin with a dented lid that she recognized immediately as the kind of thing a man keeps because he's not sure if it's useful and can't decide to throw it away. She opened it. Dried herbs. Someone's kitchen garden harvest from a previous season, tied in small bundles and left to dry. Thyme, she thought. Wild sage. Something she couldn't immediately identify but smelled like the edge of a forest after rain. "These belong to anyone?" she asked, holding up the tin. Reed looked at it. "My wife," he said. Then without hesitation, without any particular weight, "She passed 4 years ago." Nora looked at him. He wasn't asking for anything with that sentence. No sympathy, no careful handling. It was information offered plainly because it was relevant to the question she'd asked. "I'll use them carefully," she said. "Use them however you need to," he said. She made supper that night from what was available, which was not much beans that needed 3 hours to be right, but she had 2 salt pork cornbread from the last of the morning's flour, and a pot of something that was technically a stew in that it contained multiple ingredients and liquid. She added the thyme sparingly, and the dried peppers and salt in the quantity she judged the food required, rather than the quantity she thought would be accepted, without complaint. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of 12 men coming off a summer day's work boots on the porch. Low voices, water being poured over heads at the pump outside. Then the door opened, and they filed in. And she had approximately 3 seconds before the first one registered her presence, and the room changed. They weren't rude. To their credit, they weren't rude. But 12 men who've been operating without a woman's presence for 3 weeks register that presence in ways they can't entirely control. A straightening of posture, a lowering of voices, a sudden awareness of manners that had been sleeping. "Evening, ma'am," said the first one through the door. A broad man with a gray beard who introduced himself as Holt, and whose eyes went immediately to the pot on the stove, the way a man's eyes go to water in a dry summer. "Evening," she said. She kept her back to the room and kept working. They sat. She brought the food to the table in the order she'd decided on, and she did it efficiently and without ceremony, because ceremony would have invited commentary, and she wasn't ready for commentary yet. For a moment after the food hit the table, there was silence. Then Holt said quietly, almost to himself, "Lord in heaven." It wasn't the most eloquent response to a meal she'd ever received, but the way every man at the table reached for his fork with the focused attention of someone encountering something genuinely worth eating, that was its own kind of language, and she understood it clearly. She ate by herself at the kitchen counter. That was a choice, not an accident. The line between cook and company was one she intended to hold carefully, because she understood that the moment it blurred, someone at that table would feel entitled to have opinions about where she stood. Reed came in last. He'd cleaned up more than the others, she could tell by the damp at his collar, the fresh set of his jaw. He sat at the head of the table, served himself without fanfare, and ate in the same focused silence that seemed to be his natural mode. Halfway through the meal, he looked toward the kitchen. "Mrs. Calloway." She turned. "This is a good meal." "Thank you. Better than I expected," he said, and it wasn't a backhanded compliment. It was just accurate, and she appreciated accuracy. "You had more in that pantry than you thought," she said. "You were working with it wrong." A few of the men glanced at each other. Jesse, the young hand, bit his lip against a grin. Reed looked at her steadily. "I imagine that's right," he said. She didn't sleep well that first night. The room was what Reed had promised, small and private on the ground floor of the main house, with a window that faced east, and a cot with a real mattress that felt, after 6 weeks of sleeping on ground and wagon beds, almost obscenely comfortable. But comfort and rest aren't the same thing, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the sounds of a working ranch at night, the cattle shifting in the barn, the occasional low voice from the bunkhouse wind across the ridge. She thought about Gerald. She thought about the note he'd signed, the one she'd discovered only after the funeral, tucked behind the deed in the lockbox, written in Gerald's careful hand in ink that still looked too fresh. 40 acres, and the cabin promised against a debt she hadn't known existed, to a man named Aldous Creech, who operated out of Cheyenne, and who had sent 2 men in good suits to inform her 2 weeks after her husband was in the ground that she had 30 days to vacate. She had asked as calmly as she could whether there was a record of the debt. There was. She had asked whether the note was legally binding. It was. She had asked whether there was anything she could do. The men in good suits had looked at each other the way people look at each other when a question has an answer they don't intend to provide. She'd been walking since. Tung. By the end of the first week at the Granger Ranch, she had reorganized the kitchen entirely. She hadn't asked permission, because permission implied that someone else's comfort with the current arrangement deserved consideration, and the current arrangement was a disaster that was costing every person on that property time and efficiency they couldn't afford. She moved the flour to the cool shelf. She rehung the dried meat where air could reach it properly. She cleaned the rusted pot. It took 2 hours, and the patience of someone who'd learned that most things worth saving require more effort than feels reasonable, and put it back in service. She started the kitchen garden, pulling what was dead and supporting what could still produce, because there was no logic in letting the earth's effort go to waste. She also, on the 4th morning, baked bread. Real bread from a proper starter she'd begun the day she arrived, coaxed from a little flour and water and the warmth of the stove. The smell of it moved through the main house and drifted out across the yard, and she had the private, fierce satisfaction of watching 3 ranch hands find reasons to walk past the kitchen window that they absolutely had not had before. Jesse appeared at the kitchen door while she was pulling the loaves. "Ma'am," he said with the careful dignity of someone approaching something he wants very much and isn't sure he's allowed to want. "That smell, is that actual bread?" "It is," she said. "Like real bread." "Jesse," she said, "would you like a slice?" He looked like she'd offered him a horse. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Please." She cut him a piece thick and handed it over. He took 1 bite and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I don't know what Hank was doing for 3 weeks, but it was not this. Hank is your previous cook. Hank is a man who can keep cattle alive," Jesse said. "He is not a man who should be trusted with flour." She almost smiled. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying it." "I've been working on my diplomacy," he said seriously. And Reed noticed the changes. She knew he did, because he was the kind of man who noticed things without announcing that he'd noticed them, which was, she had begun to understand simply how he moved through the world. He'd see that the kitchen garden had been turned, and he'd say nothing. He'd eat supper, and his jaw would set in the particular way of a man acknowledging that something was right without feeling the need to make a production of the acknowledgement. But on the 8th morning he came into the kitchen before breakfast unusual. He normally appeared with the other men and stood at the table with his hat in his hands. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said without turning from the stove. "The men are eating better than they've worked in 2 years," he said. "Efficiency is up. Holt told me yesterday he's moving faster than he has all summer. Jesse said something similar." A pause. "I want to understand what you changed." She turned then, because the question deserved her full attention. "I didn't change the men," she said. "I changed what they put in their bodies at 4 in the morning and what they come back to at night. A man works at the level of what's fueling him. You were feeding them survival. I'm feeding them function." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the plainest description of something I've watched happen and not understood that I've ever heard," he said. "Your pantry is adequate," she said. "You have the resources. You were just working them wrong." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not quite amusement, not quite something more serious. Something between the two. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'd like to increase your wage. $1.75 a week." "I'm not going to argue with that," she said. "I didn't imagine you would." He put his hat back on. "Breakfast smells like it's almost ready." 11 minutes, she said. "I'll tell the men." He left, and she turned back to the stove, and she stood there for a moment with the wooden spoon in her hand and something in her chest that was too cautious to call happiness, but was quietly, stubbornly adjacent to it. Guys, the summer deepened. The days ran long and hot, and the men came in from the range sunburned and tired in the way that satisfying work makes you tired, not defeated, but used up in an honest way. She learned their names and their habits. Holt, who ate everything, put before him with solemn efficiency and never wasted a crumb. Jesse, who talked constantly in the kitchen doorway, and somehow never got in her way, despite always being underfoot. A quiet man named Marcus, who'd grown up in the same Missouri county she had, and who recognized something in her biscuits that neither of them needed to name. An older hand called Decker, who drank his coffee from the same dented tin cup every morning, and once after a particularly hard week of cattle work, sat down at the kitchen table and said to no one in particular, "My mother used to make cornbread that smelled like this," and then said nothing else, and she let him sit there until he was ready to go back to work. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the way she'd learned every kitchen she'd ever worked, not by being taught them, but by paying attention. The cattle rotations, and how they affected when the men needed to eat, and how much. The supply run schedule every 3 weeks, and what was reliable and what wasn't. The particular pressure that descended on the whole operation when the weather on the upper pasture turned, which it did twice that summer, sending everyone into a controlled emergency that resolved only because the men were fed and fueled and thinking clearly enough to solve the problems as they came. She also learned Reed Granger, not quickly and not by his invitation. He wasn't a man who extended invitations. But there is a particular intimacy in feeding someone day after day, in knowing what they leave on the plate and what they reach for first. She knew that he ate methodically and with full attention, that he never left a meal half-finished, that he took coffee without sugar or milk, that he ate the time-seasoned dishes with a particular quietness that she'd come to recognize as his way of processing something that affected him more than he intended to show. She knew that he worked harder than any man on his own property. She knew that he carried the operation's weight not just as a task, but as an identity, that the ranch wasn't what he did. It was what he was, and the difference between those two things is everything. She knew that he was alone in a way that had nothing to do with whether other people were present. She recognized it because she was alone in exactly the same way. It was Jessie who told her on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, when she was putting up the first of the root vegetable preservation for winter, about the note. "Mr. Granger's been quieter than usual," Jessie said, leaning in the doorway with the habitual ease of a young man who has decided he is welcome. "Since the letter came." "What letter?" she asked. Jessie shifted. "Probably not my business to say." "Jessie," he sighed. "A man from Cheyenne, name of Briggs. He's been writing about the land note for 2 years. The ranch as well. Things have been hard. Last winter was rough on the cattle and the season before that." He looked at the floor. "Mr. Granger's behind on the note, and Briggs is the kind of man who'd rather have the land than the money." Nora set down the jar she was holding. "How far behind?" "I don't know exactly, but Jessie I heard that Briggs is sending someone out in 6 weeks to assess the property, and that if the assessment goes bad, the note comes due in full." She picked the jar back up. She said nothing, but that evening after supper was cleared, and the men were back in the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was clean, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and she wrote down everything Jessie had said, and then she wrote down everything she had observed about the ranch's operation in the weeks she'd been there, and she looked at what she'd written for a long time. Reed Granger was not going to lose this land. She didn't know yet how she was going to make that true. But she had learned over a very hard 8 months that certainty about an outcome and a plan for achieving it are 2 different things, and you can have the first before you have the second. She folded the paper. She put it in her apron pocket. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the mountain, and the mountain said nothing, and she said nothing back, and between the 2 of them, they kept the secret of what was coming. Until morning broke gold and hot across the east window, and she rose at 4 o'clock, as she always did, and lit the stove and started the work of another day. The paper stayed in her apron pocket for 3 days before she did anything with it, not because she was afraid. Fear was a luxury she'd burned through somewhere between the county line and that thorn bush, and what was left in its place was something colder and more useful, the particular clarity of a woman who has already lost everything once and understands with perfect precision exactly what she is left to lose. She kept the paper because she wasn't ready, and she had learned in the months since Gerald died that acting before you're ready doesn't make you brave. It makes you reckless, and recklessness costs more than waiting. So she waited. She cooked. She fed 12 men 3 times a day, and she watched the ranch the way she'd always watched every kitchen she'd ever worked, not just the surface of it, but the logic underneath. What was moving efficiently, and what was dragging, where the energy was going and where it was leaking, what the land was producing and what it was being asked to produce, and whether those 2 numbers had any honest relationship to each other. By the 3rd day, she knew enough. She came to Reed Granger on a Thursday evening after supper, when the men had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet, and the summer dark was coming down slow and purple over the ridge. He was at the table in the main room with the ranch ledger open in front of him, and she knew from the set of his shoulders that particular stillness that isn't peace, but is the posture of a man trying to hold something together through sheer refusal to move, that he'd been looking at those numbers for a while. She set a cup of coffee on the table beside him. She sat down across from him without being invited. He looked up. "Jessie told me about Briggs," she said. Something moved across his face, not anger, not quite. More like the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight privately and has just felt it shift without his permission. "Jessie talks too much," he said. "Jessie talks the right amount for someone who's worried about the people he works for," she said. "How far behind are you?" Reed closed the ledger. He put his hand flat on the cover. "Mrs. Calloway, this isn't your concern." "You're right," she said. "It isn't. But I've been watching this ranch for 4 weeks, and I have some thoughts, and you can either hear them or not hear them. And either way, I'll be at the stove at 4 tomorrow morning. So you decide how you want to spend the next 20 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that is measuring something it hasn't decided to measure yet. Then he opened the ledger again and turned it so she could see. She studied the numbers quietly. The debt to Briggs was real, and it was not small. 2 years of accumulated interest on a note Reed's father had taken before he died, passed down like an inheritance nobody asked for. The cattle numbers were honest but insufficient. The margins were the kind that worked in a good year and failed in a bad one, and they'd had 2 bad ones in a row. "You sold 63 steers last October," she said. "That's right." "At what price?" he told her. She looked at the ledger. "You had at least 12 steers that were undervalued by probably $4 a head, maybe 5. He was quiet. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "My father sold cattle. I watched him do it for 18 years, and then I watched him not do it well for 3 of those years, and I learned the difference." She tapped the column. "These animals are being assessed at weight only. Nobody's accounting for condition. A steer in good condition in early October carries more than just weight, he carries negotiating position. If your man is going to market without that argument made clearly, you're leaving money in someone else's pocket every single time." Reed sat back in his chair. He looked at her the way you look at something that has just solved a problem you didn't think had a solution. "You know cattle markets." "I know numbers," she said. "And I know when someone is being undersold." She sat back. "Briggs sends his man in 6 weeks. What is he actually looking for?" "Evidence the ranch can carry the debt." "Which means what specifically?" "Productive operation, stable income, no signs the land is failing." "The land isn't failing," she said immediately. "The land is fine. The garden alone tells you the soil is good. The upper pasture looks thin from a distance, but it's recovering. Marcus mentioned the grass is coming back on the east side." "You talked to Marcus about the pasture." "I talk to everybody," she said simply. "People tell you things when you're feeding them. You'd be surprised." She folded her hands on the table. "The operation needs to look profitable, because it is profitable, or it's close enough that with some adjustment, it can demonstrate that clearly before 6 weeks is out. What's your cattle count right now?" He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head, which she'd always been able to do faster than most people expected, and she told him what she thought the operation could demonstrate at honest assessment. And she watched his face change as the numbers resolved into something he hadn't seen before, not because they weren't there, but because he'd been looking at them through the lens of fear, and fear makes everything look smaller than it is. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Not suspicious, genuinely curious. "Gerald, my husband, was not a practical man," she said. "He had dreams which I don't hold against him because dreams are not a character flaw. But dreams without management become disasters, and I learned very early in our marriage that if I didn't understand the numbers, no one would." A pause. Understanding the numbers didn't save the farm, but it wasn't the numbers that failed us. He was watching her with that unreadable expression again. "What failed you?" he asked. And it was the quietest question he'd asked her yet. "A man who made promises he didn't tell me about," she said. "And a legal system that didn't care which one of us was standing when the note came due." The silence between them had weight in it. Not uncomfortable, just real. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not telling you for sympathy," she said. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I know what it looks like when a good operation gets undermined by bad paperwork. And I know that it doesn't have to end that way if the operation is actually sound." She met his eyes. "Is this operation sound, Mr. Granger?" "It can be," he said. "Then let's make sure it looks exactly like what it is," she said. She stood up. She picked up her coffee cup. "I'll have some thoughts written out by Saturday. You can do what you want with them." She went back to the kitchen. She heard him sit for a long time in the main room before he finally closed the ledger and went upstairs. She had the thoughts written out by Friday. She hadn't meant to finish a day early, but the problem had gotten into her head the way problems do when you're the kind of person who can't leave a thing half solved. And she'd sat up past midnight with the pencil and the paper and worked it through until she had something that looked less like an opinion and more like a plan. She left it on the kitchen table before breakfast. When Reed came down at 5:30 before the other men, she was at the stove, and the paper was at his usual chair. She didn't say anything about it. He picked it up. He read it standing, which told her he hadn't expected much. Then he read it again sitting down, and the second read was slower, and she kept her back to him and her attention on the stove, because watching a man absorb something is too intimate an act to be done directly. "You're suggesting we move the sale date," he said finally. "By 3 weeks," she said. "The animals will be in better condition. The grass on the east pasture will be recovered enough to show honest weight gain, and you'll have 3 additional weeks of feeding them the way I've been managing the kitchen stores, less waste, better conversion." "You've been managing the feed stores too." She glanced over her shoulder. "I've been watching how Marcus feeds the horses. Same principles apply." Reed set the paper down. He was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me my cook has been informally managing my livestock operation." "I'm telling you that someone with eyes has been watching what the eyes that are supposed to be watching have been missing," she said. "No disrespect to your men. They work hard. But hard work and efficient work aren't always the same thing." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh cut off by the discipline of a man who doesn't give that away easily. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to ask you something directly." "All right. Why are you doing this?" She turned from the stove fully then. She looked at him steadily. "Because I know what it is to have something taken from you that shouldn't have been taken. And because you gave me a job when I was on my knees in the dirt eating dead berries, and you did it without pity, which is the only kind of help worth accepting." She paused. "And because I'm good at this, and I've spent 8 months not being able to use it, and I would like very much to be useful again." Reed Granger looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need from me." That was the moment. Not a romantic one, nothing so uncomplicated as that, but a shift real and structural in the way they occupied the same space. He had asked what she needed. Not what she wanted, not what she thought. What she needed. And he intended to provide it. "Access to the full ledger," she said, "and your honest assessment of each animal's current condition, which I'm going to need from you and Holt together, because Holt knows these steers better than anyone." "Done," he said. "And I need you to stop looking at the numbers through the assumption that you've already lost," she said. "Because that assumption is wrong, and it's the most expensive mistake you're making." He held her gaze. "You sound very sure." "I am very sure," she said. "Breakfast in 12 minutes." Holt, when approached, turned out to be less surprised than she expected. He was a man of 60-something, weathered past the point where age showed as anything but character, and he had the particular manner of someone who has spent a very long time being good at something and does not need to advertise it. He looked at her across the fence rail where he was assessing a pair of young steers, and he listened to what she said without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "The east pasture's been coming back for 3 weeks. I told Mr. Granger in July." "What did he say?" "He said he'd noted it." Holt paused. "Mr. Granger notes a lot of things and then carries them privately. It's how he was raised." "Is that useful?" she asked. "Not always," Holt said. He looked at the steers. "What you're saying about the sale date makes sense. These 2 alone would be worth considerably more in 3 weeks. The condition is there. It just needs time to show." "Can you put numbers to it?" He looked at her sideways. "You want me to write it down?" "I want it in the ledger as an estimate," she said. "Not an opinion. An estimate from a man who has worked cattle for 40 years about the projected value of this herd at 3 weeks against current. That's evidence. That's the kind of thing an assessor from Cheyenne has to take seriously." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald Calloway was your husband?" She stilled. "Yes." "I knew him," Holt said. "Knew of him anyway. Word gets around in cattle country." He paused. "I'm sorry about what happened to your land." "Thank you," she said. "He wasn't a practical man," Holt said with the directness of someone who considers honesty a form of respect. "But you are." She looked at him steadily. "Will you write the estimate?" "I'll write the estimate," he said. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." The second week of her involvement in the ranch's financial planning was harder than the first because the first week had been about identifying problems, and the second week was about solving them. and solving them required the kind of sustained attention that exhausts a person in ways that identifying problems never does. She managed the kitchen with one part of her mind and the ledger with another, and she did it without letting either one slip, which was its own kind of testimony to what she was capable of when she had something worth being capable for. Jesse, who had the useful combination of good instincts and absolute discretion, began helping her without being asked. Not with the numbers, which weren't his strength, but with the logistics. He knew which suppliers could be negotiated with and which ones held fixed prices. He knew which of the neighboring ranches had had good seasons and might be interested in a cooperative arrangement at market. He knew things because Jesse was the kind of young man who pays attention to everything and files it all carefully in case it becomes useful, and it was becoming useful now. "There's a man named Hale," Jesse told her one afternoon, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while she worked through a column of supply costs. "2 ranches over. He's got a bigger operation, sells through the same market. If Mr. Granger's steers went to market same day as Hale's, they'd be assessed together and the group would carry more weight, literally and otherwise." She looked up. "Does Hale know Granger?" "They've met. It's not warm, but it's not cold. What would it take to make it warm enough?" Jesse thought about it. "Hale's got a fence problem on his south boundary. 3 weeks ago he mentioned it at the feed store. Marcus heard it and told me." She looked at Jesse. "You're telling me that if Reed Granger sent men to help fix Hale's fence, we might be able to arrange a joint sale?" "I'm telling you that in cattle country," Jesse said carefully, "most good things happen after one man helps another man with something that needed doing." She sat back. "Jesse, how old are you?" "19, ma'am." "You are a very old 19, she said. He looked pleased with himself. "I've been told that." She brought it to Reed that evening. He listened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Hale's fence. "The south boundary. Marcus can confirm the details." "You've been talking to Marcus about Hale's property." "I've been talking to Marcus about a lot of things," she said. "He knows more about this valley than anyone on your payroll, and he doesn't volunteer it because nobody's asked him directly. I asked him directly." Reed was quiet. "You have good men," she said. "They know things you haven't thought to ask them. That's not a criticism, it's an opportunity." "You keep finding opportunities," he said, and there was something in his voice that had shifted from the careful neutrality of the first week. A warmth under it. Not demonstrative, just present. "I've spent 8 months not having any," she said. "I'm making up for lost time." He looked at her. "I'll ride over to Hale's tomorrow." "Take Holt," she said. "Hale will trust the assessment from a man who's worked cattle as long as he has." "You've thought this through." "I think everything through," she said. "It's a habit." "A useful one," he said. "The most useful one I have," she agreed. The ride to Hale's ranch produced results faster than she'd expected, which was either a testament to Reed Granger's quiet authority when he chose to deploy it, or to the universal willingness of working ranchers to accept help with a fence problem when it comes without conditions attached. Holt came back that evening with the report delivered in his particular spare style that communicated more in what it didn't elaborate on than in what it said. "Hale agreed to the joint sale," he said, setting his hat on the hook inside the door. "He's got 40 head in similar condition. Combined, it changes the conversation at market." A pause. "He also said Granger was the first man who'd ridden over without wanting something." Nora was at the stove. "What did Reed say to that?" "He said he did want something, but the fence needed fixing regardless." Holt almost smiled. "Hale liked that." She nodded. She turned back to the stove. "Supper in 30 minutes." "Ma'am," Holt said, and then, after a pause that she recognized as the kind that contains something unspoken, "What you're doing for this ranch, I want you to know it's seen." She didn't turn around. "I'm doing my job," she said. "Your job description didn't include any of this," he said quietly. "And we all know it." She kept her eyes on the pot. "Holt," she said, "go wash up." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she heard the smile in it. 4 days before Briggs's man was due to arrive, something shifted in Reed. She noticed it the way she'd noticed everything about this ranch, not all at once, but in accumulated detail. He was sleeping less, she could tell from the hour at which she heard him moving in the rooms above her in the mornings, rising before she did, which hadn't happened before. He was eating the same quantity, but with less attention, which in a man like Reed, a man who was never careless with his food, was significant. He sat with the ledger every evening, and she could see from the kitchen the way his hand rested on the cover without opening it, which was the posture of a man who has looked at the same numbers so many times that looking at them again no longer changes what they say. On the fourth night, she brought him coffee and sat down across from him without preamble. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said. He looked up. "I'm not afraid." "Reed." It was the first time she'd used his given name. They both registered it. "Tell me what you're afraid of." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My father built this ranch. 32 years. He put everything he had into this land, including things he shouldn't have put in money. He didn't have notes he couldn't carry, hopes he didn't tell anyone about." He paused. "He died thinking it was stable. He died not knowing about the Briggs note, because he'd already forgotten he'd signed it. The mind went before the body did." His jaw tightened. "I spent 3 years after his death trying to understand what I'd inherited, and by the time I understood it, I was already behind." She sat with that. "You didn't create the debt," she said. "No, but I'm the one who's going to lose the land if I can't service it." "You're not going to lose the land," she said. "You don't know that." "I know the numbers," she said. "And the numbers with the joint sale and the adjusted pricing and Holt's assessment in the ledger show an operation that can service the debt. Not easily, but honestly." She leaned forward slightly. "Briggs's man is coming to find a reason to recommend foreclosure. I need you to understand that he will be looking for weakness, and the worst weakness you can show him is the one you're showing right now." Reed looked at her. "Which is?" "A man who doesn't believe his own operation is worth saving," she said. "That reads in everything. How you stand, how you answer questions, how you look at your own land." She held his gaze. "This ranch is worth saving. I have watched it for 6 weeks, and it is worth saving. You need to know that the way you know your own name." The silence between them was different from the ones before. Those had been neutral. This one was charged with something neither of them was ready to name. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. Quiet, direct, truly. She thought about it honestly because he deserved an honest answer. "Because I watched a good thing get destroyed by someone else's negligence and someone else's greed, and I couldn't stop it. And this time, I can see it coming, and I have the tools to do something about it, and I am not going to sit on my hands and watch it happen again." She paused. "And because this is a good ranch. And you are a good man. And good things should not fall to people like Aldous Briggs and his counterparts in Cheyenne, who have never worked a piece of land in their lives." Reed Granger looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Nora." It landed differently than she expected. Her name in his voice with that particular quietness had a weight she wasn't entirely prepared for. "The assessor comes Wednesday," she said, pulling herself back to the practical where she was safest. "I want to go through the presentation with you tomorrow. All of it. The numbers, the joint sale arrangement, Holt's written assessment, the pasture recovery documentation Marcus is putting together. Marcus is putting together documentation. Marcus went to school for 2 years before his family needed him on the land," she said. "He writes clearly and his observations are accurate. I asked him. He said yes." She stood up. "Tomorrow evening, after supper." She picked up the coffee cup and turned toward the kitchen. "Nora," he said again. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. And it wasn't what a man says when he's being polite. It was what a man says when something has reached him that he didn't expect to reach him, and he has no other words for it that are both accurate and appropriate. She didn't turn around. "Go to sleep, Reed," she said. "You look like you haven't in 3 days." She heard him after a moment push back from the table. She heard him go upstairs. She stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment with her hand on the counter, and the summer night pressing warm against the window, and she let herself feel briefly, and without indulgence, the full weight of everything she was carrying. Then she rinsed the cup, dried her hands, and went to bed. Wednesday was coming, and she intended to be ready. The preparation took the full 2 days. Not because the material was complicated, she had organized it clearly enough that it could be presented in under an hour, but because Reed Granger needed to know it in his bones, not just his head. An assessor from Cheyenne would be looking for hesitation. For the microsecond between question and answer that tells a practiced man that the person speaking is reciting rather than knowing. She drilled him. There was no other word for it. She sat across from him at the kitchen table on Tuesday evening with the ledger between them, and she asked every question she could construct that a man sent by Aldous Briggs might ask, and she made him answer each one without looking at the paper. Current cattle count by category. He answered. Projected sale value at current condition versus adjusted condition at 3-week delay. He answered. Basis for the joint sale arrangement with Hale. He answered. Holt's written assessment. What does it conclude? He answered that one without hesitation, and with a confidence that she recognized as genuine, not performed, not rehearsed, but real, because in the days since she'd handed him Holt's written assessment, he'd read it enough times to have made it his own. She pushed harder. If the assessor challenges the Hale arrangement as speculative, it's not speculative, Reed said. It's contracted. Hale signed an agreement. I have the copy. He met her eyes. Briggs's man can read. She held his gaze. Good, she said. Say it exactly like that. Something moved across his face. You're not a gentle teacher. No, she agreed. But you don't need gentle. You need accurate. He sat back in his chair. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more frequently, that measuring unresolved expression that she'd stopped trying to decode because decoding it would require her to decide what to do with the answer. What were you? He asked. Before. What did you do? I kept a farm running that my husband couldn't keep running on his own, she said. And I raised the money 3 times when the numbers went wrong, and I negotiated twice with lenders who thought a woman in a room was decoration, and I won both times because I knew more than they expected, and I let them underestimate me long enough to use it. She paused. And then I lost anyway. Not because I wasn't good enough. Because the note Gerald signed was signed before I knew it existed. Reed was quiet. The system failed you, he said. The system was designed for men named Briggs, she said. Yes. He picked up the pencil from the table and set it down again. A gesture that she'd learned meant he was processing something he hadn't entirely resolved. After Wednesday, he said. When this is handled, I want to talk about your role here. She looked at him. My role is cook. Your role has been considerably more than cook for 3 weeks, he said, and I think you know it. She held his gaze. Let's get through Wednesday first, she said. He accepted that. He picked up the ledger. One more time, he said. From the beginning. She straightened in her chair, and they began again. Wednesday arrived the way bad things always do, quietly, without drama, in the ordinary light of a morning that looked exactly like every other morning, except that it wasn't. Nora was at the stove at 4 o'clock as always. She heard Reed come down the stairs at 5 earlier than usual, and she heard him go to the front window and stand there for a moment, the way a man stands when he's listening for something he'd rather not hear. She didn't say anything. She poured his coffee and set it on the table and went back to the biscuits, because the best thing she could give him right now wasn't reassurance, it was normalcy. A ranch that ran exactly as it always ran, with breakfast on the table and the kitchen warm, and every man at his post doing what he was supposed to be doing. That was the argument, and she intended to make it without a single word. The men ate. Reed ate. He was quieter than usual, but not the collapsed quiet of a man losing his nerve, the focused quiet of a man who has decided how he's going to carry himself and is holding to it. She noticed that. She was glad of it. He'll come late morning, Jessie said quietly, appearing at the kitchen door after the others had gone out. That's how these men work. They want to see the operation mid-stride, not fresh. How do you know how these men work? She asked. I grew up in Laramie, Jesse said. I watched Briggs's men take 2 ranches before my father moved us out here. He paused, and for a moment the 19-year-old disappeared entirely, and something older and harder looked out of his eyes. I know exactly how they work. She looked at him. Then you know what to do today. Work like it's any other day, he said. Exactly like any other day, she said. Not harder, not more carefully, exactly the same. He nodded. He started to go, then stopped. Ma'am, for what it's worth, and I know it ain't much coming from me, I think you've already won this. She turned back to the stove. Go to work, Jesse, she said, but she held on to that for a moment privately before she let it go. The assessor arrived at 10:30. His name was Garrett Fowler, and she saw him from the kitchen window without meaning to. A compact man in a dark coat riding a horse that was too good for frontier territory, carrying a leather satchel that had the deliberate, expensive look of an object designed to communicate authority. He had the manner of a man who has been sent to deliver bad news so many times that he has stopped noticing what bad news costs the people receiving it. Reed met him in the yard. She couldn't hear the exchange from where she was, but she watched Reed's posture straight, unhurried his hat brim, level his hands easy at his sides, and she felt something in her chest loosen slightly. He was holding exactly right. She went back to the stove. She made the midday meal with particular care, not because she was performing for anyone, but because this was what she did, and doing it well was its own form of testimony. An hour later, Reed brought Fowler into the main room. She could hear their voices through the kitchen wall, Fowler's clipped and businesslike, asking questions that were designed to sound like conversation. Reed's measured and direct answering each one, without elaboration, without defensiveness, without the faint apologetic undertone that tells a practiced assessor that the person speaking doesn't fully believe what they're saying. She kept her hands moving. She listened. Cattle count, Fowler said. Reed gave it. Condition assessment. My foreman has a written evaluation. Holt's been working cattle for 40 years. His assessment is in the ledger. A pause. Papers moving. Then, this is thorough. It's accurate, Reed said. That's what matters. Another pause. You've arranged a joint sale with the Hale operation. That's right. Contracted. You'll find the agreement at the back of the ledger. It improves our market position at October sale and Hale's as well. It's a practical arrangement. When was this arranged? 2 weeks ago, Reed said. When it became clear it was advantageous to both parties. Fowler said something she couldn't make out. Then, the numbers here show a significant improvement in projected income against last year's figures. The operation has improved, Reed said simply. That's what the numbers reflect. She held her breath without meaning to. What changed? Fowler asked. There was a pause, a real one long enough that she found herself gripping the edge of the counter. Management, Reed said. I made some adjustments to how the ranch is being run. What kind of adjustments? The kind that work, Reed said. And his voice had that quiet, unarguable quality that she'd come to recognize as his most effective register. Not aggressive, not defensive, just absolute. The voice of a man stating a fact that doesn't require his opinion to be true. She let go of the counter. She went back to stirring. Fowler stayed for 2 hours. She heard him move through the main room, heard him ask to see the barn, heard the door close behind him as Reed took him out. She heard from the yard Holt's voice, deliberate, authoritative, the voice of a man who has earned his knowledge 1 decade at a time and is not remotely interested in being second-guessed about it. She heard Fowler ask a question, and Holt's answer, which was long and specific, and delivered with the calm finality of a man who knows more about the subject at hand than the man asking will learn in a lifetime. Jesse appeared in the kitchen doorway midway through. Holt is explaining to him in considerable detail the difference between a steer assessed at weight only and a steer assessed at condition and weight combined, he said. I don't think Fowler expected the depth of that conversation. Is Holt enjoying himself? She asked. Jessie considered. Holt is being professional, he said. But yes, I think he's enjoying himself. She almost smiled. Marcus is in the east pasture, Jessie added. Fowler asked to see the pasture recovery. Marcus is showing him. How is Marcus doing? He brought the documentation you asked him to write, Jessie said. He handed it to Fowler without saying a word and just waited for him to read it. A pause. Fowler read it twice. She exhaled. All right, she said. Midday meal in 20 minutes. Are we feeding Fowler? She thought about it for exactly 1 second. Set a place, she said. Politeness costs nothing, and it makes people uncomfortable in useful ways. Jessie looked at her with something approaching reverence. Yes, ma'am. Sure, Fowler ate. She brought the meal out herself, she'd made sure of that because she understood that a woman who could produce this quality of food for 12 working men was information, and information presented clearly and without comment was its own kind of argument. She set the plates without ceremony and went back to the kitchen and stayed there because her presence at the table would have invited a dynamic she didn't want to introduce. But she listened. Fowler ate for a few minutes in the silence that men fall into when food is better than they expected. Then, your cook's work. Yes, Reed said. She's been here how long? 6 weeks. Another pause. She heard Fowler set down his fork. Mr. Granger, I'm going to be direct with you. I prefer that, Reed said. I was sent here expecting to recommend foreclosure proceedings, Fowler said. Mr. Briggs's assessment based on the last 2 years of records was that this operation was in terminal decline and that the note would not be serviceable. A pause. That assessment is not supported by what I've seen today. The silence that followed had texture. The joint sale arrangement is solid, Fowler continued. The cattle assessment is well documented and defensible. The pasture recovery is genuine. I've seen enough failing land to know the difference. And the operational efficiency reflected in these numbers suggests meaningful and recent improvement. He paused again. I'll report what I've found. My report will reflect a viable operation. Reed said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level. I appreciate your honesty. Mr. Briggs won't be pleased, Fowler said. I want you to understand that. He'll look for other angles. Let him look, Reed said. She was standing perfectly still on the other side of the kitchen wall. Her hand was pressed flat against the wood without her having decided to put it there, and she could feel her own heartbeat against her palm. One more thing, Fowler said. The woman who organized this, the financial restructuring, the Hale arrangement, the pasture documentation, that wasn't you. It wasn't a question. Reed didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, a kind of careful, deliberate honesty that cost something. She saw what I wasn't seeing, he said, and she did something about it. She should have been a lawyer, Fowler said, and his voice had something in it too. Not warmth exactly, but the closest thing to respect a man like Fowler probably allowed himself. She's a better cook, Reed said. And there was something in how he said it, quiet, almost private, that was not about cooking at all. Fowler left at 1:30. Reed came back into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was washing the midday dishes, methodical, her back to him. Nora, he said. She turned. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before, not the careful neutral, not the measuring look. Something that had come down from behind those. Something real and unguarded and slightly dangerous for both of them. He's going to report viable, he said. I heard, she said. Briggs will push back. I know. He said he'll look for other angles. He will, she said. And we'll handle them. Reed looked at her. We, he said. Not a question. Just the word held up to the light. She felt it land, but she kept her hands moving. The operation, she said. The ranch. He took 2 steps into the kitchen. He stopped. He was close enough now that she could see the exact quality of what was in his face, which was the expression of a man who has something to say, and is deciding with great deliberateness whether the moment is right for it. "Nora," he said, "I need to say something to you." "Reed." "I know the timing isn't right," he said. "I know there's still Briggs and the note and everything that's unresolved, and I know you've been here 6 weeks, and that isn't very long by any honest measure." He stopped. "But I think you know what I'm carrying, and I'd rather say a true thing at the wrong time than say nothing and let it sit between us unacknowledged." She set down the dish. She turned to face him fully. "This ranch runs because of you," he said. "Not just the food, not just the ledger, because of how you see things, because of what you do with what you see." He paused. "I don't know what your plans were when you were walking west. I don't know if this is a stopping place or if it's something else. But I want you to know that whatever it is, whatever you decide it is, I'm asking you to know that you matter here, not as a cook, as a person, as—" He stopped himself. He reset. "As someone I would very much like to keep knowing." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he began, she could see, to wonder if he'd miscalculated. "Reed," she said carefully, "I came here with nothing. I have been very careful in these 6 weeks not to let the fact that someone was kind to me convince me that I'm in a position to make decisions about the future." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. He closed his mouth. "I came here with nothing, and in 6 weeks I've rebuilt something. Not for you, or not only for you, for myself. Because I needed to know I could still do it." She paused. "And I find, having done it, that I am not as eager to leave as I thought I would be." He was very still. "That's not a declaration," she said. "That's information, which is all I'm able to offer honestly right now." "That's enough," he said. And he meant it. She picked up the dish again. "Briggs," she said. "What's his next move?" Reed seemed to make a deliberate decision to follow her back to practical ground, which was one of the things she'd come to value about him. He understood when a conversation was finished, and he didn't push past the ending. "He'll look at the note itself. Try to find terms we've missed. Try to call it due on a technicality. Do you have a lawyer?" "Not one I trust." She thought for a moment. "Marcus mentioned a circuit judge who comes through Laramie every 2 months. Do you know who he is?" Reed's eyes sharpened. "Beaumont. Judge Beaumont. He's honest." "Could you get a letter to him before Briggs's next move?" "Possibly. What would the letter say?" "That you are a ranch owner in good standing with a viable operation, and a documented case for the note's serviceability, requesting that any legal proceedings regarding the Granger land note be subject to his court rather than whatever Cheyenne arrangement Briggs is likely to prefer." She set the dish in the rack. "Briggs is powerful in Cheyenne because he has relationships in Cheyenne. Beaumont operates out of territorial authority, which is harder to influence." Reed stared at her. "How do you know about circuit court jurisdiction?" "Gerald's lawyer explained it to me," she said. 2 days after the funeral. He told me that if I'd known earlier, I might have had options." She turned and looked at Reed directly. "You have the chance to know earlier. Use it." He nodded slowly. "I'll write to Beaumont tonight." "Good," she said. "And get it out with tomorrow's supply rider, not the regular mail. I don't trust Briggs not to have eyes on your correspondence." He looked at her for a moment with that expression again, the one she'd stopped trying to decode. "Nora, is there anything about legal and financial procedure that you don't know?" "Plenty," she said. "But I know enough. Go write the letter." She didn't sleep well that night either, but for different reasons than before. Before the sleeplessness had been about fear, the low-grade continuous anxiety of a woman who has no ground under her feet and is perpetually calculating the distance to the next solid thing. This sleeplessness was different. This was the sleeplessness of someone who has ground under her feet and is just beginning to understand what that means. She lay in the dark and thought about what Reed had said. Not the declaration part, the word matter. You matter here, Not as a cook, as a person. She had not been told that she mattered as a person in so long that the sentence had landed in an unfamiliar register, like hearing a word in a language she'd once spoken fluently and hadn't used in years. Gerald had loved her in his way. She believed that. But Gerald's love had been the kind that relies on the other person to manage everything that love doesn't think to attend to: the bills, the notes, the practical architecture of a life, and then doesn't notice when that labor disappears because it was never visible enough to notice. She had mattered to Gerald, but she had mattered the way air matters to a man breathing completely and invisibly and only in its absence. Reed Granger was not Gerald. She pushed that thought carefully aside and went to sleep. The letter to Judge Beaumont went out the next morning with the supply rider. Reed gave it to the man himself privately with instructions that matched what Nora had suggested: direct delivery, no post office, no intermediary who might feel the pull of a more generous payer. She watched from the kitchen window. Jessie appeared beside her because Jessie always appeared when something significant was happening, drawn by a sixth sense that she'd given up trying to explain. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked. "Probably," she said. "Smart," he said. "Necessary," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Are you planning to stay on this ranch, long term?" She looked at the supply rider disappearing down the trail. "I'm planning to get through the next 30 days, she said. "After that, I'll reassess." Jessie nodded slowly. "That's a practical answer." "I'm a practical person." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "But practical people can also want things." She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who has said exactly what he intended to say and is comfortable with the consequences. 19 years old and already possessed of a wisdom that most men arrived at, if they arrived at it at all, somewhere in their 50s. "Go to work, Jessie," she said. "Going," he said. He didn't quite hide his smile. "Dio." The response from Briggs came 4 days later. Not from Fowler. Fowler's report had apparently been filed as promised because no challenge came from that direction. The response came directly in the form of a letter addressed to Reed in handwriting that was too neat to be natural, the handwriting of a man who has practiced authority even in his penmanship. Reed read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice, and she watched his face go through 3 separate things: surprise, then something harder and colder, then a stillness that she recognized as controlled fury in a man who keeps his fury below the surface. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it. Briggs was not challenging the assessment. He was challenging the note itself, specifically a clause in the original document that she hadn't known existed, and that Reed, from his expression, clearly hadn't either. A clause that stipulated the debt could be called due in full at Briggs's discretion if the property changed operational management structure without prior written consent. "What does that mean?" Jessie asked from the doorway. She hadn't realized he was there. "It means," she said carefully, "that Briggs is claiming that the changes to the ranch's operation, the ledger restructuring the Hale arrangement, the adjusted sales strategy, constitute a change in management structure that triggers the full note." The kitchen went very quiet. "He's saying," Jessie said slowly, "that fixing the ranch is the reason he can take it." "Yes," she said. Reed had not moved. His hands were flat on the table, and his face was the face of a man looking directly at an injustice and recognizing it for what it was. Not surprise, because he'd suspected Briggs would find an angle, but the specific, exhausting recognition of a man who has fought hard and found the rules changed on him after the fight. "Is the clause valid?" Jessie asked. She read it again. "That depends on how operational management structure is defined," she said, "and whether the changes I made can be characterized that way, given that my role here is cook, not manager." "Your role here is considerably more than cook," Reed said. His voice was very quiet. "Legally, my role here is cook," she said. She looked at him. "Reed, the letter to Beaumont. Has there been a response?" "Not yet." "We need it," she said. We need it before Briggs's lawyers file anything in Cheyenne." She set the letter down. She pressed her palm flat on it, the way he'd pressed his palm on the ledger, that gesture of containment. "This clause, do you have the original note?" "Yes." "Get it." He got it. She read the original document carefully, twice, then a third time, because the third read is where you find the things you missed, and she found it. "Here," she said. She set the original note beside Briggs's letter and pointed to a line. "The clause says operational management structure, not operational practice, not method. Structure." She looked up. "Your management structure hasn't changed. You are still the owner and operational authority of this ranch. I have no formal role in management. I have no contract, no title, no documented authority over anything except the kitchen." She tapped the line. "What I did was advise. What you did was make decisions. That's not a structural change. That's a man running his ranch with better information than he had before." Reed stared at the document. "Can we argue that?" Jesse asked. "We can do more than argue it," she said. "We can demonstrate it. Every decision made in the last 6 weeks was Reed's decision. The Hale arrangement Reed rode to Hale's property. Reed signed the agreement. The adjusted sale date Reed authorized it. The letter to Beaumont Reed wrote and sent it." She looked at Reed. "What did I do?" He understood immediately. "You cooked," he said, "and you offered some thoughts when asked. Which is what an employee does," she said. "Which is what I am." Jesse exhaled audibly. "That's the argument. That's the argument," she said. "And it's not just defensible, it's accurate. I never made a single decision on this ranch. I presented information to a man who made his own decisions with it." She looked at Reed steadily. "Briggs knew something was different. He didn't know it was you who changed it. He assumed it was me because it's easier to attack the cook than the owner." A pause. "That assumption is about to cost him." Reed was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, and couldn't entirely categorize something that was partly the relief of a man who has found solid ground, and partly something else, something deeper and more personal that she didn't look at directly. "Write that down," he said. "All of it. Exactly as you said it." "I will," she said. "And when Beaumont's response comes, we attach it all together and we send it back to Briggs's lawyers before they file anything." She stood up. "And then we wait." "How long?" "Not long," she said. "Men like Briggs move fast when they think they've found the angle. They move equally fast when the angle closes." Holt appeared in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in from the yard. But he was there, and from his face he'd heard enough. "You think this holds?" he said. "I think it holds," she said. "I think it holds because it's true." Holt looked at Reed. Reed looked at Holt. Something passed between them, the wordless language of men who have worked together for years, and then Holt said, "All right," and went back outside. Jesse said nothing. He just looked at her for a moment with that expression of his, the one that was too old for his face, and then he too went back to work. And she sat down at the kitchen table, smoothed out the original note, and began to write. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote with the same methodical attention she brought to every task she'd undertaken since arriving at this ranch. Not frantically, not with the electric speed of panic, but steadily, sentence by sentence, argument laid against argument, evidence stacked in careful sequence. She wrote the way her father had taught her to do, arithmetic 1 column at a time, checking each line before moving to the next, because the only errors that matter are the ones you don't catch before the answer is final. Reed sat at the far end of the table. He did not interrupt. He brought her a cup of coffee at some point without being asked, and she drank it without taking her eyes off the page. This was, she understood, a kind of partnership she hadn't experienced before. Not a man directing and a woman executing. Not a woman managing and a man unaware of being managed, but something more symmetrical and more honest. Each of them doing what they did best in service of the same outcome. When she finished, she set down the pencil and pushed the document toward him. He read it. When he was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man looks when something has resolved that he wasn't certain would resolve. "Nora," he said. "It's solid," she said. "It won't fail on the argument. The question is whether Beaumont's response comes before Briggs' files." "It'll come," he said. "Beaumont is a fast reader and a faster decider." "How do you know?" "He was my father's friend," Reed said. "Before the mind went." She stopped. "Your father knew Beaumont?" "For 30 years," Reed said. He paused. "I should have written to him a year ago." She looked at him. There was nothing useful in saying yes, you should have, so she didn't say it. "You're writing to him now," she said. "That's what matters." He looked at her across the table. The summer evening was coming through the window and landing on the document between them, and in that light, the paper looked almost luminous. All those sentences carefully built, standing between the ranch and the thing that wanted to take it. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about what this place would look like right now if I hadn't ridden down that ridge." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the document. "Then, you did ride down," she said. "That's the only fact that matters." He held her gaze. "I'm glad I did," he said. She picked up the document. She straightened it. She set it down again. "The response from Beaumont," she said. "When it comes, whoever gets to it first brings it directly to the other. No waiting." "Agreed," he said. "And in the meantime," she said, "we run the ranch exactly as we have been. Nothing changes. Nothing looks different. We give Briggs nothing to point at." "Agreed," he said again. She stood up. It was past supper time, and she hadn't started anything, and there were 12 men who would be coming in from the range in an hour, needing to eat. "Reed," she said, picking up the coffee cups. "Nora, this is going to hold," she said. And she said it the way she'd told him the numbers were right, not to comfort him, but because it was true. And she had learned in a very hard school never to say a thing was true unless she was certain it was. He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. She went to the stove. She started supper. And outside, the summer evening settled over the Granger Ranch like something that intended to stay not provisional, not borrowed, but simply quietly, permanently present. Beaumont's response came on a Friday. Jesse got to it first. He was the one who met the rider at the gate, because Jesse had been meeting every rider at the gate for 6 days, with the focused vigilance of a young man who has decided that being useful is the most important thing he can do and is executing that decision with everything he has. He came through the kitchen door at a dead run, which he'd never done before, and he put the letter on the counter beside her hand without a word, and the look on his face said everything the envelope hadn't said yet. She picked it up. She looked at it. She set down the spoon she was holding. "Get Reed," she said. Jesse was already gone. She didn't open the letter. That wasn't her letter to open. It was addressed to Reed Granger from the Territorial Circuit Court of Judge Clarence Beaumont, and whatever it contained belonged first to the man whose name was on it. She had learned in the months since Gerald died that the most important boundary a woman in her position could maintain was the one between helping and appropriating, and she held that line with the same deliberateness she held every other line she'd drawn since arriving here. Reed came in from the yard, still carrying the tool he'd been working with, a leather strap from a harness he'd been repairing, and he set it on the table and took the letter from her and stood there and read it. She watched his face. She had learned to read Reed Granger's face the way she'd learned to read a fire, not by the obvious signals, the dramatic flares, but by the subtle shifts underneath the changes in heat that told you what was happening before it became visible on the surface. So she saw it when the careful neutrality gave way to something else. Something that moved through him from his jaw, down through his shoulders and into his hands, which stopped being still for the first time since he'd picked up the letter. "He's granting jurisdiction," Reed said. She felt it go through her own chest. Not relief yet, because relief required certainty, and this was only the first step, but the particular sensation of a door opening into a room you'd been afraid might not exist. "Any proceedings regarding the Granger land note," Reed read, his voice controlled and deliberate, "are hereby subject to the review of this court under territorial authority. Parties seeking to enforce, modify, or accelerate terms of the aforementioned note are directed to file with this court no later than... He stopped. He looked up. 30 days. Which means Briggs has to file in Beaumont's court, she said. Not Cheyenne. Yes. And Beaumont is honest. Yes, she exhaled. That's the playing field changed, she said. Completely. Reed set the letter down on the table. He put both hands flat on it, that gesture she'd seen him make with the ledger with Briggs's letter, the gesture of a man pressing down on something to make sure it's real. Briggs is going to be furious, he said. Yes, she said. He will. He'll look for another angle. He'll try, she said. But every angle he has is weaker outside Cheyenne than inside it. His leverage is relational, not legal. Inside Beaumont's court, relational leverage doesn't work. Holt came through the back door. He looked at Reed. He looked at the letter. He said nothing, because Holt was a man who read a room the way Nora read a ledger quickly, and without needing to be told what the numbers meant. Beaumont, Reed said. Holt nodded once. Good, he said. He picked up his hat from the hook. He went back outside. Jesse appeared in the doorway. Well, we have 30 days in a fair court, Reed said. Jesse closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them, and his expression was back to its usual composed alertness. But she'd seen it the brief, unguarded moment of a young man who has been afraid for the people he cares about, and has just been given permission to stop. All right, he said. All right. What do we need to do? Prepare the filing, she said. Everything I wrote organized in the order Beaumont will expect to see it. Reed's operational authority documented at every point. The Hale Agreement. Holt's assessment. Marcus's pasture documentation. The ledger projections. She looked at Reed. Do you have someone who can present this to the court? A lawyer Beaumont would trust? Reed thought for a moment. There's a man in Laramie, Thaddeus Crane. He's not brilliant, but he's honest, and Beaumont knows his work. Can you get him a letter today? I can ride to Laramie myself. She looked at him. That's 2 days. 1.5 if I push. He was already thinking through it, she could see, not recklessly, but with the focused calculation of a man who understands what a problem requires and is willing to provide it. Holt can run the operation. I can run the kitchen, she said. I know you can, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was just a fact stated with the same plainness he brought to every fact, and somehow that was better than any compliment would have been. He left within the hour. She stood on the porch and watched him ride out, not dramatically, not with the weight of ceremony, just a man on a good horse moving at purpose across summer land, and she stayed there a moment longer than she needed to before she turned and went back to work. The ranch without Reed was a different kind of quiet. Not worse, the men were capable, and Holt ran things with the same unhurried efficiency that marked everything he did, but different. The way a room is different when the person who anchors it steps out even temporarily. She felt it and noted it and set it aside, because noting a feeling and being governed by it are different things, and she had not survived the last 8 months by being governed by her feelings. She ran the kitchen. She ran it the way she'd run it every day since she arrived, precisely, attentively, with the full measure of her ability, and she also, in the hours between meals, continued to work on the court documentation, refining the argument she'd written, adding detail where detail strengthened the case, and removing it where it muddied clarity. Marcus sat with her on the second evening after supper. He'd come in quietly the way Marcus did everything, and sat across from her at the kitchen table without announcing what he wanted, which was his way of indicating he had something to say, and was waiting for her to signal she was ready to hear it. She set down the pencil. Marcus, ma'am. He folded his hands on the table. He had steady hands. She'd noticed that about him from early on. The hands of a man who does careful work and has done it long enough that carefulness has become instinct. I want to tell you something about the East Pasture Report. All right. I wrote it as clearly as I could, he said. But there's something I didn't include because I wasn't sure if it was relevant, and I've been sitting with it for 3 days. She looked at him steadily. Tell me. The East pasture recovery isn't just normal, he said. It's better than it should be for this point in the season. The soil composition on that side of the property is different. There's a water table closer to the surface. In a drought year, that pasture stays productive when the rest of the range fails. He paused. If Briggs's case rests partly on the claim that this land is in decline, that pasture is evidence that the land has inherent productivity that isn't dependent on management. Even in a bad season, that ground holds. She was very still. That's not a small thing, Marcus. No, ma'am, he said. It isn't. Can you add it to the report? Specifically the water table, the soil composition, the comparison to the surrounding range. I'd need to frame it in plain language. I'm not a geologist. You're a man who has worked this land for years and has observed what he's describing directly, she said. In Beaumont's court, observed fact from a credible witness outweighs technical language from an expert who's never set foot on the property. She held his gaze. Write what you know, exactly what you know, nothing you don't. Marcus nodded. He took the paper she pushed toward him. He wrote for 40 minutes, slow and careful and complete. And when he handed it back to her, it was exactly what she'd asked for. Plain, specific, unembellished, and worth more than 3 pages of legal argument. Thank you, she said. Ma'am, he said. He stood up. He hesitated. Mrs. Calloway, can I say something else? Go ahead. When I came to work for Mr. Granger 4 years ago, this ranch was in better shape than it is now. Not because he's a bad operator, he's not, but because the 2 bad winters took something out of the operation that he's been trying to rebuild alone. He paused. What you've done in 6 weeks, it's not just the ledger and the hail arrangement and the court filing. It's that the men are working differently. They're present, I suppose. There's a difference in how a man works when he goes home at the end of the day to something worth going home to. He looked at the table. I'm saying it badly. You're saying it clearly, she said. He looked up. I hope you stay, he said. That's all. I hope you stay. She sat with that for a moment after he left. She sat with it the way she sat with things that were too significant for immediate response, carefully, at a slight distance, so she could see the full shape of it without being overwhelmed by it. Then she picked up the pencil and went back to work. Reed came back on the second afternoon exactly when he'd said he would, which told her something about him that she already knew, but appreciated being confirmed. He estimated accurately, and he delivered on what he said he would deliver. He came straight to the kitchen. He didn't stop to clean up, didn't stop to speak to the men in the yard, and the fact that he came to the kitchen first told her something too, which she noted and did not examine too closely. Crane will take the case, he said. Good. He's read a summary I gave him, and he thinks the jurisdictional argument is clean. He set his hat on the table. He also said, and I want to tell you exactly what he said, that whoever prepared the financial documentation clearly understood both the operational reality of a cattle ranch and the legal standard for demonstrating note serviceability, and that in his experience, those 2 things are rarely understood by the same person. She kept her eyes on the stove. He's being generous. He's being accurate, Reed said. Which is what you always say matters. She turned around. Reed was standing at the table with the particular posture of a man who has traveled hard and is not yet ready to rest, because there is still something to be said, and she looked at him and recognized with the clarity that comes from paying close attention to a person over time that he was about to say it. Briggs sent another letter, he said. It was here when I got back. Jessie has it. The air in the kitchen changed. Get it, she said. Jessie appeared. He'd been waiting. She realized just outside the doorway, which was exactly what Jessie would do, and he handed over the letter with the expression of a young man delivering something he wishes he didn't have to deliver. She read it. Briggs had received notice of Beaumont's jurisdictional order. His response was not legal. It was personal. He wrote in that too neat handwriting that Reed Granger was welcome to pursue his territorial court proceeding, and that in the meantime, Briggs intended to make certain inquiries regarding the circumstances of Gerald Calloway's note, a note which Briggs claimed to hold as well on a separate property matter, and regarding the widow Calloway's presence on the Granger ranch, which he characterized in language that was carefully chosen and precisely aimed as a matter that a man in Reed Granger's position might want to consider carefully before it attracted wider attention. She read that last paragraph twice. Then she set the letter down. The kitchen was very quiet. "He's threatening your reputation," Reed said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard before, not the controlled quiet of a man managing himself, but the hard, cold quiet of a man who has found his limit. "He's implying—" "I know what he's implying," she said. "It's a lie." "I know that too. Nora." He took a step toward the table. "He's doing this because he has nothing left on the legal argument. He knows the court filing is solid. He knows Crane is competent. He knows Beaumont is honest. So he's going after the only thing he thinks might make me back down." His jaw was set in a way she'd never seen it set before. "He doesn't know me very well." She looked at Reed steadily. "What he's implying about me, about my presence here, could damage your standing in this community. You understand that?" "I understand that he wants me to believe that," Reed said. "I also understand that any man in this valley who knows me and knows the quality of work being done on this ranch will reach his own conclusions. And any man who takes Aldous Briggs's word over what he can see with his own eyes isn't a man whose opinion I care about." She held his gaze. "Reed, this is real risk. Not abstract. Real." "I know. Your answer is still the same." "My answer," he said with a quietness that had nothing tentative in it, "is that I am not going to be moved by a dishonest man using dishonest tactics. And I am not going to allow someone who has been nothing but decent and capable and hard-working to be made into a weapon against herself." He paused. "That's my answer." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, not because she'd chosen to hold it, but because the last 8 months had required it shifted. Not broke, shifted. The way something shifts when pressure that's been constant finally eases and the body doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of the weight. "We need to respond to this," she said, because the practical was where she was safest and clearest. "Formally through Crane. The threat regarding my presence here needs to be addressed on the record before it can become anything Briggs can use in court." "How?" "A sworn statement," she said, "from me, stating clearly my role on this ranch, my legal status as an employee, and the nature of my work here, filed with Beaumont's court as part of the record." She paused. "If it's on the record, it's no longer a rumor Briggs can shape. It's a documented fact, and documented facts are considerably harder to weaponize." Reed looked at her with that expression again, the deep, unresolved one that she'd stopped trying to categorize. "You're going to put your name on a court document to protect this ranch," he said. "I'm going to put my name on a court document that states the truth," she said, "which is that I am the cook at the Granger Ranch, and I have done my job here with full propriety, and anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to bring that suggestion into a court of law where I will address it directly." She held his gaze. "I've been afraid of men like Briggs before. I was afraid when they came to my door after Gerald died. I was afraid, and I was alone. And I had no ground under me, and I lost." She paused. "I am not afraid now, and I am not alone. And the ground is solid. A beat. Let him push." Reed was quiet for a very long moment. Then, "I'll write to Crane tonight. Tell him about the sworn statement. I'll have it written by morning." He nodded. He started to turn, then he stopped. He turned back. And he did something she hadn't expected. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just for a moment, one hand covering hers, where it rested on the letter, firm and warm, and entirely without ambiguity. "Nora," he said. "Thank you." She didn't pull her hand away. She didn't lean into the gesture either. She just let it be what it was, a moment of simple human acknowledgement between two people who had been through something together and were not yet at the place where they could say all of what that meant, but were no longer pretending the something hadn't happened. "Go write the letter," she said. He went. Che. She wrote the sworn statement at the kitchen table alone in the hour before midnight, when the ranch was quiet and the summer dark was full outside, and the only sound was the scratch of her pencil and the occasional movement of the fire in the stove. She wrote it carefully. She wrote it in plain language that could not be misread and could not be reframed and could not be used against her in any direction she hadn't chosen herself. She stated her name, her widowhood, the date of her arrival at the Granger Ranch, the terms of her employment, the nature of her duties, and the precise character of every interaction she'd had in a professional capacity. She was thorough, and she was accurate, and she was underneath the careful legal language absolutely unafraid, and she thought that lack of fear might be the most significant thing she'd produced since arriving here. When she was done, she read it once. She folded it. She put it beside Reed's letter to Crane on the table, and she went to bed, and she slept for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate without difficulty. Crane filed both documents with Beaumont's court on the following Tuesday. Briggs's response arrived on Thursday, not another letter this time. An attorney. A man named Holloway, who rode up from Cheyenne on a horse that matched Fowler's in quality and exceeded it in ostentation, and who arrived at the Granger Ranch with the specific air of a man who expects his arrival to constitute a form of pressure in itself. Reed met him in the yard. She watched from the kitchen. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she could read it. Holloway talking with the smooth-paced delivery of someone making a prepared argument, and Reed listening with his arms loose at his sides, and his hat brim level, and his face giving away exactly nothing. Then Reed said something. Short. 3 or 4 words. Holloway's delivery stopped. Reed said something else, still short. Holloway reached into his satchel. He produced a document. Reed took it, looked at it, and handed it back. Holloway put it away. He said something. Reed shook his head once. Holloway turned his horse and left. She was at the stove when Reed came through the back door. "What did he want?" she asked. "Settlement," Reed said. "Briggs is offering to forgive 30% of the note balance in exchange for a deed transfer on the South 40 acres. She turned. "The South 40 has the best water access on the property." "Yes, it does. He wants to drain the value from the ranch rather than take the whole thing. Now that Beaumont has jurisdiction, yes." Reed set the document on the table. He sent a formal offer. Holloway said I had 7 days to respond. She looked at the offer. She read it. "This is less than he would have gotten through the original foreclosure," she said. "Yes." "He's retreating. He's retreating to a position he thinks is still worth holding," Reed said. "But yes." She set the document down. "Your answer?" He looked at her. "What do you think my answer should be?" "I think," she said slowly, "that you should take this to Crane before you give any answer. I think Crane needs to look at the offer in the context of the court filing and advise you on whether accepting the South 40 transfer creates any vulnerability to future claims on the remaining property." She paused. "And I think that if Crane says the remaining property is clean and fully yours after the transfer, the 30% debt forgiveness might be worth the land loss, because a settled debt has no angles for Briggs to exploit." Reed was watching her. "And if Crane says it creates vulnerability, then you decline," she said, "and we take it to Beaumont." "We," he said. Again, the word sitting between them with the same weight it had carried every time he'd said it. "The ranch," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "I'll ride to Laramie tomorrow," he said. "I'll take the offer to Crane." "Take the original note too," she said. "And the court filing. He needs the full picture." "I know." He picked up the offer. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his face that she recognized now, that unguarded quality that appeared more often and stayed longer than it had in the beginning. The quality of a man whose defenses have not fallen, but have simply stopped feeling necessary in a particular direction. "When this is over," he said, "when the note is settled and Briggs has no more angles, I want to talk to you about what comes next." She looked at him steadily. "What comes next for the ranch?" "For you," he said. "Here. What comes next for you here?" She held his gaze for a moment. She thought about the east pasture coming back green. She thought about Jesse and his old young eyes. She thought about Holt and the way he'd said what you're doing for this ranch with the particular gravity of a man who does not distribute acknowledgement carelessly. She thought about Marcus, and I hope you stay. She thought about a woman kneeling in summer dust at the edge of a dying thorn bush, pressing bitter berries against her tongue and telling herself they tasted like something. "Talk to Crane," she said. "Come back, and then we'll talk." He accepted that. He put his hat on. He went to the door. "Read," she said. He stopped. "Whatever Crane says about the offer, make the decision you can live with. Not the one that minimizes risk. The one that's right." She paused. "You know the difference." He stood in the doorway for a moment with that expression on his face, the full, unguarded one. "Yes," he said. "I do." He tipped his hat. "I'll be back by Saturday." He left. She stood at the stove and listened to the horse leave the yard, and listened to the sound of the summer valley resume its ordinary register, the cattle, the wind. Jesse's voice somewhere in the distance, the creak of the barn, and she thought with a clarity she hadn't had access to in a very long time that she had built something here. Not Reed Granger's ranch. That was his, and it always had been, and she'd helped him hold it, which was a different thing, and an honorable thing, and exactly the kind of thing she'd needed to be able to do. She had built herself back. Piece by piece, meal by meal, number by number, argument by argument, decision by decision. She had rebuilt the thing inside her that Gerald's death, and the note, and the men in good suits and the county line and the thorn bush had stripped down to almost nothing. She knew who she was again. And standing in that kitchen in that summer light, she understood that knowing who she was made every other question, what she wanted, what she would choose, what came next, not easier exactly, but answerable. For the first time in 8 months, the questions had answers. She just needed Reed to come back from Laramie so she could start giving them. Reed came back on Saturday, as he'd said he would. She heard the horse before she saw him, that particular rhythm she'd learned to distinguish from the other horses on the property. The roan's heavier, steadier footfall coming up the trail in the late afternoon, when the summer light was going gold and long across everything. She was at the stove. She did not go to the window. She gave him time to put up the horse, time to wash, time to gather whatever he was carrying before he brought it to her. He was at the kitchen door in 20 minutes. She turned around. His face told her before his mouth did. Not dramatically. Reed Granger didn't do anything dramatically, but there was something settled in it that hadn't been there when he left, the quality of a man who has made a decision he is at peace with and has stopped weighing it. "Crane says the transfer is clean," he said. "South 40 to Briggs, 30% of the note forgiven, the remaining property free and clear with no future claim pathway." He sat down at the table. He reviewed everything. His language was, he said, it was the cleanest resolution he'd seen on a note dispute in 15 years. She set down the spoon. She sat across from him. "And your answer to Briggs?" "I accepted," Reed said. "Crane filed the acceptance with Beaumont's court this morning. Briggs has 48 hours to execute the transfer agreement or forfeit the settlement offer entirely." She looked at him. "You're certain?" "The South 40 is good land," he said. "Losing it costs something, but it costs less than 2 more years of Briggs finding angles, and it costs nothing compared to losing the whole property." He met her eyes. "You said make the decision I can live with. I can live with this one." She nodded. "Yes," she said. "You can." "It's done," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, final, with the completeness of a man setting down something he's been carrying a very long way, landed in the kitchen, like the first real silence either of them had experienced in weeks. She got up. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She put one in front of him and kept one in her hands and sat back down. Outside, she could hear Jesse somewhere, and the cattle, and the late summer birds in the ridge timber. the ordinary sounds of a ranch that was still standing. "You said," Reed began, "that when I came back we'd talk." "I did," she said. He looked at her across the table. He had that expression, the fully open one, the one she'd stopped trying to categorize because categorizing it would require her to admit what she already knew it meant. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. As I want to say this right, so I'm going to take a moment to find the right words." "Take the moment," she said. He put his hands flat on the table. "I am a man who has been running this ranch alone for 4 years," he said. "Not just without a partner alone in the way that matters. Without someone who sees the same things I see and understands why they matter. Without someone I trust to tell me when I'm wrong." He paused. "I didn't know how much that was costing me until you sat down across from me with that ledger and told me I was looking at my own numbers wrong." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to stay because you're useful," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This ranch has survived, and it will continue to survive, and your work here has been the reason for a great deal of that, and I am not trying to retain an asset." His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm asking you to stay, because I have not once in 4 years looked forward to the end of a day the way I look forward to coming in and sitting at this table. And I think you know what that means, even if I'm saying it in the most unromantic way possible." She looked at him for a long moment. "It's actually fairly romantic," she said. Something in his face shifted the smallest movement barely visible, but she caught it. "Is it?" "For you," she said. "Given what I know of how you talk, yes." He looked at her steadily. "Then stay," he said. "That's all, stay." She thought about the woman on her knees in the summer dirt. She thought about the 6 cents in the carpet bag and the dented tin cup. She thought about the county line and the thorn bush and the specific bitter taste of a berry she'd eaten, not because she thought it would save her, but because stopping would have meant admitting she had nothing left. She thought about how far she had come, and she thought about where she was sitting right now, and she thought that the distance between those two things was the most significant journey she had ever made. Not the walking, not the miles, but the internal landscape she'd crossed to get from that woman in the dirt to this woman at this table. "I'm going to need a proper contract," she said, "with terms we both agree on in writing." Reed blinked, then he nodded. "Of course. And I need it understood clearly between us that I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because I am choosing to stay. That distinction matters to me." "It matters to me too," he said. And he meant it. She could hear it. "And I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I haven't said yet because the timing was never right, and now it is." He waited. "I know what it is to be in a place without choosing it," she said. "To be somewhere because circumstances drove you there and kept you there and gave you no alternative. I lived that for most of my marriage, not because Gerald was a bad man, but because I stopped paying attention to whether I was choosing my life or just living it." She paused. "I am paying attention now, and what I am choosing clearly with full knowledge of what I am doing is this ranch, these people." She met his eyes. "You." The kitchen held very still. Reed Granger reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, the same gesture he'd made before, but different now, fuller, more deliberate, the gesture of a man who is no longer offering comfort, but making a claim, and has made certain the claim is welcome before he makes it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and that was that. Holt found out first because Holt found out everything first, not through gossip, not through Jesse's comprehensive information network, but because he was a man who watched the world with the patient, accurate attention of someone who has learned that what people do is more reliable data than what they say. He came into the kitchen the morning after Reed came back from Laramie and looked at Nora for a moment, and then said without preamble, "Good." She looked at him. "Good, good," he said again. He poured himself a cup of coffee and went back outside. Jessie found out approximately 20 minutes later through mechanisms she chose not to examine, and his response was to appear in the kitchen doorway with an expression of such transparent satisfaction that she had to turn back to the stove before she laughed. "Jessie," she said. "Ma'am," he said. She could hear the grin in it. "If you say anything about this being about time, I will put you on dish duty for a month." "I wasn't going to say that," he said. "What were you going to say?" A pause. "I was going to say that I'm glad. That's all. Just glad." She kept her eyes on the stove. "Go to work, Jessie." "Going," he said. And he went, and she could hear him all the way across the yard. Marcus heard that afternoon. He said nothing, but he came in for supper that evening and sat down and looked at his plate for a moment before he ate with the expression of a man offering up a private and genuine gratitude for something he'd hoped for and had been uncertain he'd receive. She saw it and she understood it, and she let him keep it without comment. Briggs executed the transfer agreement in 46 hours, 2 hours before the Beaumont deadline, in what Crane described in his letter to Reed as the kind of reluctant compliance that indicates a man who has calculated his remaining options and found them insufficient. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Reed read it at the kitchen table with Nora sitting across from him, and when he looked up, his face had the clean, uncomplicated quality of something finally finished. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. Jessie in the doorway said, "It's done," and then disappeared before either of them could respond. Holt, who was not in the doorway and had not heard the letter read, appeared from the barn. 15 minutes later, looked at Reed's face and said, "I'll tell the men." He went back to the barn. That evening she made the best meal she'd produced since arriving at the Granger Ranch. Not for performance. She was past performing for anyone, but because it was a good meal for a good reason, and a good reason deserved a response equal to it. She used the herbs from the tin that had belonged to Reed's wife, the thyme and the sage, and the thing that smelled like a forest after rain, and she used them with full generosity, not the careful sparingness of a woman uncertain of her welcome, and the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. The men ate with the particular silence of people encountering a meal that exceeds their expectations and doesn't want to be interrupted by their own reactions. Holt ate with his eyes on his plate, methodical and fully present. Jessie ate fast, the way he always did, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound well-being. Marcus ate slowly, attending to it the way he attended to everything, making it last. Reed ate last. He always ate last. But tonight, he looked up midway through and looked at her where she stood at the kitchen counter, and the look he gave her was not complicated, and it was not tentative, and it had none of the careful measuring of the early weeks. It was simply a man looking at a woman he has chosen, and knowing she has chosen him back. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks after the Briggs settlement, Thaddeus Crane rode out from Laramie unannounced on a Thursday morning. She saw him come up the trail and went to find Reed, who was in the barn with Holt, and by the time they came out, Crane was already at the hitching post with his satchel open and something in his hand. "I have news," he said, "that I didn't want to put in a letter." Reed looked at the document in Crane's hand. "What is it?" "It's about Gerald Calloway's note," Crane said. He looked at Nora. "Your husband's property. The Cheyenne matter." She went very still. "I took the liberty," Crane said carefully, "of reviewing the original note against Aldous Briggs's claim. The note your husband signed." He paused. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to ask you, in the original document, was there a witness signature?" "Yes," she said. "2 men from Briggs's office. Both of them," Crane said, "were employees of Briggs at the time of signing. Under territorial law, a note witnessed exclusively by employees of the party with financial interest in the note is not independently witnessed. It's a defect in execution." He looked at her steadily. "The note may not be legally enforceable." The yard was completely silent. She heard herself breathe. She heard the cattle. She heard Jessie somewhere behind her make a sound that was not quite a word. "What does that mean?" Reed said, and his voice was very quiet, the way it got when he was managing something large. "It means," Crane said that if Mrs. Calloway wishes to pursue recovery of her husband's property, there is a legitimate legal basis to challenge Briggs's original claim. The land may not have been legally his to take. She stood in the summer morning and felt the ground under her feet, and she thought about 40 acres and a cabin and 18 years of work and Gerald's careful handwriting and ink that was too fresh and 2 men in good suits and 30 days to vacate. "How strong is the challenge?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "In Beaumont's court," Crane said, "with the defect documented and the witness conflict demonstrated strong. Not certain, but strong." She looked at Reed. He was looking at her, and his face had gone to the fully open register, not waiting for her to decide what she wanted, not preparing to tell her what he thought she should do. Just present. Just there. "What do you want to do?" he said. Simply. She thought about it. She thought about it honestly, which meant she thought about what the land meant to her now versus what it had meant before. Before the thorn bush, before the 6 cents, before the kitchen and the ledger and the men who had become her people over the course of a summer. "I want the challenge filed," she said. "I want Briggs to answer for what he did legally and publicly in a court that's honest." She paused. "Not because I need the land. Because what he did was wrong, and wrong things should have to stand in a room and be called what they are." Crane nodded. "I'll file with Beaumont within the week." "What's the timeline?" 4 to 6 months for a full hearing. Possibly less if Briggs concedes when he sees the defect documented. "Will he concede?" Crane looked at her with the expression of a man who has been a lawyer long enough to have calibrated opinions about human behavior. "He conceded on this ranch when the legal ground shifted," he said. "I believe he will recognize that pattern when he sees it again." She looked at Reed. "Is that all right with you? This extending into the fall?" He looked at her steadily. "Nora, you just said, not for the land, for the principle. I'm not going to have an opinion about your principles." She held his gaze. "You might need to eventually. If this is going to be..." She stopped. Started again. "If what we're building here is what I think it is." He didn't look away. "Then I'll tell you my principle," he said. "My principle is that Aldous Briggs has been using the law as a weapon against people who couldn't fight back, and I would like very much to be part of watching that come to an end." He paused. "That's my principle. It happens to match yours." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to Crane. "File the challenge," she said. "And thank you for coming yourself." "I had reasons to come myself," Crane said, and glanced at Reed in a way that suggested Crane had understood the situation at the Granger Ranch considerably faster than he'd perhaps been expected to. He put the document back in his satchel. "I'll be in touch." He rode back down the trail, and the 3 of them stood in the yard. Reed, Nora, and Jesse, who had materialized during the conversation with the predictability of a young man who has appointed himself the unofficial witness to every significant event on this property. And for a moment, nobody said anything. Then Jesse said, "Briggs is going to have a very bad autumn." "Jesse," she said. "Ma'am." "Go to work." "Already going," he said, and he went, and there was no hiding the satisfaction in his step. September arrived the way autumn arrives in mountain country, not gradually but decisively. A change in the quality of the air one morning that says without room for argument that the season has turned. The light shifted. The ridge timber went from summer green to the first hints of something warmer and more complicated. And the cattle moved differently in the cooler mornings. And the men's appetites changed in the way she'd learned to read and accommodate the way she read and accommodated everything on this ranch. She stood in the kitchen and felt it and understood what it meant. Summer was the season she'd arrived in. Summer was the thorn bush and the berries and the long hot trail and the hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Summer was the ledger and Fowler and Briggs's letters and the night she'd sat at the kitchen table alone, writing arguments by candlelight while the mountain held its silence around her. Summer had given her everything. And now summer was ending, and the ranch was standing, and so was she. Holt came in for breakfast with the first frost still on his coat collar. He sat down and ate, and then he said to no one in particular, in the way he sometimes said the most significant things, "East pasture is holding. Going to be a better winter than last year." "Marcus's water table," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Holt said. "That ground doesn't fail." He drank his coffee. Good thing someone looked at it properly. She put more biscuits on the table. Reed came in last as always, and sat at the head of the table as always, and ate with the full, unhurried attention he always brought to meals. And when the other men had finished and cleared out, he stayed as he had begun to stay most mornings, sitting with his coffee while she moved through the kitchen, doing the last of the cleanup, the two of them occupying the same space in the easy, unforced way of people who have learned each other's rhythms and found they fit. "Crane sent a letter," he said. "Came yesterday. I meant to tell you last night." She turned. "Briggs? He's received the challenge filing." Reed set the cup down. "Crane says his lawyer requested a meeting to discuss settlement." She looked at him. "That was fast." 4 days after the filing," Reed said. "Crane thinks he saw the witnessed effect immediately and did the same calculation Crane did." He paused. "Crane says the settlement offer will likely include full return of the property and acknowledgement of the note's defective execution." The kitchen went quiet. "In writing," she said. "In writing, on the record, in Beaumont's court." She sat down. She sat down because her legs made the decision before she did, and she pressed her hands flat on the table, and she looked at her own hands for a moment and thought about how long she had been holding things tightly and what it would feel like to stop. "He's going to give it back," she said. "It looks that way," Reed said quietly. "The land Gerald couldn't keep." "Yes." She looked up. "I don't need it," she said. "I want you to know that. This isn't about needing a piece of land to have somewhere to stand. I already have somewhere to stand." "I know," Reed said. "But I want him to give it back," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and entirely without anger, which was the most powerful way she knew to say it. "Because it was wrong. And because if he gives it back in Beaumont's court on the record, then the next widow who comes to him doesn't face what I faced. Because precedent matters. Because the law is supposed to protect people, not harvest them." Reed looked at her across the table. "Tell Crane to take the meeting," he said, "and to accept nothing less than full return written acknowledgement and Beaumont's signature on the agreement." "That's what I would have said." "I know," he said. "We tend to arrive at the same place." She looked at him. "We do," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and this time neither of them pulled back, and neither of them redirected it towards something practical. And the morning light came through the kitchen window and landed on their hands where they rested together on the table. And outside the ranch was making its ordinary sounds. The cattle and the wind, and Jesse's voice somewhere, and none of it was extraordinary, except that all of it was. Briggs settled in October. Full return of the Calloway property. Written acknowledgement that the original note had been executed with defective witnessing. Beaumont's signature on every page. Filed in the territorial court record, permanent and public and available to any future party who wished to review the history of Aldous Briggs's business practices in the territory. Crane rode out to deliver the documents in person again. She suspected he had come to enjoy riding out. She read the settlement with Reed at the kitchen table, and when she was done, she set it down, and she was quiet for a moment, with her hand resting on the final page on Beaumont's signature on the line that said in the formal language of territorial law that what had been taken from her had been taken wrongly and was hereby returned. She thought about Gerald. She thought about him carefully and honestly, without the softening that grief sometimes applies to memory. He had been a man of dreams and insufficient practicality, a man who had loved her in the way he was capable of loving, which was not always the way she'd needed to be loved. He had left her with a debt she didn't know about, and a piece of land she couldn't keep, and a grief she'd had to carry alone across 6 weeks of summer road until she found a thorn bush. She forgave him. Not for his sake, he was past the point where forgiveness reached him. For hers. Because carrying the unforgiveness was a weight she no longer needed, and the ground under her feet was solid enough now that she could put things down. "All right," she said. She looked up at Reed. "It's done." "It's done," he said. She pushed the document toward him. "Keep it with the ranch records," she said. "I don't need to hold it." He looked at her for a moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "The land isn't why I'm here, and it was never what I was fighting for." She met his eyes. "I was fighting for the principle, and the principle is in that document in Beaumont's handwriting in the territorial record. That's enough." He took the document. He held it for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do with the property?" She had thought about this. "Sell it," she said. "At fair value to someone who will work it. The money goes into the ranch account." She paused. "Into our account." Reed was very still. "If that's what we're calling it," she said. "That's what we're calling it," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite rough, but was in that direction, the voice of a man who has been careful for a long time about what he allows himself to want, and has just been given permission to stop being careful. She stood up. She went to the stove. She put the kettle on because there are moments in life that deserve a ritual, even a small one, and hot coffee is as good a ritual as she'd ever found. She listened to the ranch outside, the steady, ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a place that was working and fed and standing, that had come through a hard summer and was heading into autumn with its ground solid and its debts resolved and its people fed and present and exactly where they meant to be. Jesse appeared in the doorway. He looked at Reed. He looked at Nora. He looked at the settled document on the table. He looked at the expression on Reed's face and the way Nora was standing at the stove and the general quality of the air in that kitchen. "It worked," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "All of it. All of it." He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has just had an entire season of worry resolved simultaneously. "Well," he said. "Good." He looked back at her. "What's for supper?" She almost smiled. "Something worth eating," she said. "Same as always." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he went back to work. Reed stood up from the table. He walked to the stove. He stopped beside her, not behind her, beside her, the way people stand when they are occupying the same space by mutual decision. And he looked at the kettle, and then he looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing left that needed to be said by way of explanation or argument or careful qualification. "Stay," he said, the same word he'd said before, but different now. Full. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. And outside, the first real touch of autumn came down off the mountain and moved across the Granger Ranch, across the east pasture, coming back green across the barn and the bunkhouse and the kitchen garden, across 12 men doing honest work on solid ground. And the ranch did not merely survive the season. It lived,